Hello, I'm Charlie Dittmeier. I'm a diocesan priest from Louisville, Kentucky, and now I'm working as a Maryknoll associate priest in Cambodia. I work with deaf people. When I was a little boy, I had a dream that I was going to live and work in a foreign country, and that I would know the language so well that no one would know I was a foreigner. Now, obviously, I had to be thinking about Europe. I'm never going to blend in Asia. But here I am, and now I speak Khmer a little bit, and I speak Cambodian Sign Language a lot. I started working with deaf people when I was in the seminary. I was in my final year at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, and a priest in Louisville who was working part-time with deaf people wrote to all of us going to be ordained deacons and asked if any of us were interested in working with the Catholic deaf community. I wrote back and told him no, because I had spent 2 summers working in a state mental hospital in a training program, and I thought I would do something in counseling or mental health. But I was curious, so that last summer at home, I went to a week-long camp for deaf children, and I got more curious. So when I went back to Baltimore, we had to do in-service training, and I got myself assigned to work with a deaf chaplain in Baltimore, and I learned sign language while I was there. And then when I went back to Louisville and was ordained a priest, I asked the Archbishop if I could continue working with deaf people, and he was very happy to agree to that. I worked in a parish and worked with deaf people just once a month for the first few years, but then we started having masses every week and doing more and more things. And finally, I left the parish at the end of my term, and we started a Catholic deaf office. And I also started working in a Catholic high school. I then began to meet with the 5 or 6 other priests in the United States who were working with Catholic deaf people. And at one of those meetings, a visiting priest from India came, and he had set up a technical training center for the deaf in Bangalore and invited any of us, if we were interested, to come and volunteer with him. I thought that would be really cool, but it ended up being 10 years before I actually was able to leave. I spent 2 years in Bangalore at the Technical Training Center, and I fell in love with Asia. So when it was time to go back to Louisville, I wrote to the Archbishop and said, I'm coming home, but is it possible maybe to go again for a longer time? And he wrote back and said, well, let's talk about that when you get to Louisville. We did talk, and he was open to it, so I joined Maryknoll as an associate priest. I told them I wanted to work with deaf people. They said, that's fine. I said, I'd like to work in Asia. They said, that's fine. I said, I'd like to work in India. And they said, well, we don't work in India. So I ended up being assigned to Hong Kong. And that was great. It was certainly a very, very different assignment, but it was a good one. It was rather ironic that in the seminary studied 6 years of Latin, 4 years of Greek, 3 years of French, and 1 year of Hebrew. And I end up in Hong Kong speaking Chinese and using Hong Kong Sign Language. In Hong Kong, I was there 13 years, and I was the pastor of an actual deaf parish. We had our own church in an old refugee center, and I worked part-time in a Catholic deaf school. On the side, too, I was spiritual director for a Guadalupe missionary seminarian. Their seminarians went to study theology in Hong Kong. And because I was associated with the Catholic deaf group there in Hong Kong, he became associated with them too. And he fell in love with them and wanted to work with them. And so after he was ordained, we arranged that he would take over the deaf work there, and I would go to another place where they had no priest. And so I ended up transferring to Cambodia. That was a difference like night and day. Hong Kong is a first world modern city with all the technology, all the resources, all social services, anything you could want. And Cambodia had nothing. Up until 1997, there were no deaf schools, no sign language, no organizations working with deaf people in Cambodia. So it was quite different. Some things, though, in the deaf world are universal. One of them is the idea that deafness is an invisible disability. You don't see people in wheelchairs or people using a cane on the street. And so because it's invisible, deafness doesn't get the attention and the services that many other disabilities are able to acquire. And so it's different in that regard. Also, too, there's not much understanding about deafness. Deaf people are all around us, but most people have never met a deaf person and so have no experience of the problems and the situation of people who cannot hear. People around the world who are deaf experience that sense of being invisible and not getting attention, but they're also, too, around the world experience isolation. A deaf child from birth does not have a common language with his parents, with the family growing up, later with the school, with society. It's really hard to overcome that. And so they tend to be isolated and not to have all the contacts and the relationships and the friendships that hearing people have. And all of that is worse in Cambodia. There was really nothing here before 1997. And so when the Deaf Development Program was started in 1997, what they tried to do was to locate deaf people and to begin, since there were no deaf schools, to provide some education. The same year that DDP started in 97, a French NGO started some deaf schools. And so in order that we would not compete with them, we started working with deaf people who were 16 years of age and above. So the younger children that we found, we sent to the French school, and the older children that they found, they sent to us, because they only had a first grade that first year, and then a second grade, and adding a grade every year. And we were able to get going, but it's really, really difficult working with a deaf community in a culture and a society where there's so little understanding of the problems, and where there's such limited funding and such limited resources. We literally have to go out looking for the deaf people. There is no registry of deaf people in Cambodia. We estimate there's about 61,000 profoundly deaf people. There are no official registries, there's no list of deaf people, but deafness is uniform around the world. And so we took the percentages, like in North America, and applied that percentage to the 16 million people in Cambodia. And it tells us there's about 61,000 profoundly, completely deaf people, and about 600,000 hard of hearing people. But we don't know who they are, where they are. We have to find them. Occasionally, one of them will find us. One day, a motorcycle taxi driver drove up to our deaf office, and he said, "I found this deaf man on the street." And it was a young deaf man. We figured he was about 18 or 19. He had no language. He had no identification. He had nothing. And he looked like he was Khmer, that he was from Cambodia. But he didn't like Cambodian food. He wasn't dressed like a Cambodian. He had a stack of new Cambodian money. Not a lot of money, but like the money you would get from a money changer who would give you new bills. And because he had no identification or anything, we began to believe that he was from another country, that he was from a Cambodian family, but he was born in another country and somehow had come here and become lost. We tried everything we could to help him to find his family. We figured he was looking for his family, and that his family was looking for him. We took him, to different embassies and showed him pictures of other countries where he might have come from. We tried to use gestures because he had no sign language. He was talking about mountains and things like that, and we don't have mountains in Cambodia, so that was another clue that he was from another country. And we took him around, we showed him pictures of like the Eiffel Tower and mountains in the United States and the outback in Australia, and just all kinds of things to see if any of those things would, oh yeah, you recognize that. But he didn't seem to recognize anything. We went to Interpol, the International Police. We went to the International Red Cross, to their Missing Persons Bureau. We did everything we could to see if anybody was looking for him or if we could find any way to reconnect him with his family, and we couldn't. So we put him into our education program, 2 years of non-formal education, and then a year of job training. We trained him as a barber. And he became a good barber and got a really good job in a local barber shop that dealt with a lot of people. And one day, after he had been there a few years, a man came in and he looked at him, he says, "I know that man, the barber." He said, "He's from my village out in another province." And that was the first clue that we had that anybody, had any idea where he had come from. And our social worker started working, and we took pictures of this deaf barber, and we took the pictures to the village that this man was getting the haircut. He told us what village to go to. And we showed the pictures to people there, and they said, "Oh yeah, here's his family." We didn't take the boy there because we didn't know why he had left the village. Maybe he had been abandoned, maybe he had been abused and run away, so we didn't want to put him in danger. But we talked to the family, and after we were sure that they wanted him back, that he was really appreciated and cared for and loved, then we reunited them. So it was a wonderful success story. But that was one of the people who found us. And it just points out that, the challenge of trying to find all these deaf people. 61,000 of them in Cambodia. The deaf school and our program, both of them started in 1997. And in those 24 years, we have found 3,000 of the estimated 61,000 deaf people. That means there's 58,000 other deaf people here in Cambodia. They're out standing in a field right now harvesting rice. They have no language, never been to school, and can't talk. They've never met another deaf person, and they think they're the only deaf person in the world. And so a big part of our job is trying to find these people and then to convince them and convince their parents to let them come to school. Many times the parents don't want them to come to school because the deaf son can plant rice as well as a hearing person. The deaf daughter is kept at home to care for the babies, to cook and to clean, and then lets the mother sell vegetables in the market. So they don't want the child to go to school because they lose income. But that's what we have to do, is find these people and then invite them, encourage them to come. It's very, very time consuming. Our field workers go village to village in the provinces. It is extremely slow and extremely expensive because they have to stay out a week at a time, living in guest houses and things like that. We have experienced the pandemic here in Cambodia like every place else in the world. Some things we've done better, some things we've done worse. But I've noticed in watching on television the news clips from Australia, from Europe and North America. They have officials, health officials, government officials explaining what to do, and they almost always have a sign language interpreter beside the official who's speaking, so that the deaf community can also get that information. That's been an unexpected positive benefit of the pandemic, that it has helped hearing people to understand, yes, deaf people don't know all these things until they have sign language interpreters. They need access to information, and so we have to provide interpreters. So that's been a really good benefit since making society more aware of the needs of deaf people. Society, hearing society generally really doesn't know much about deaf people. Deaf people have a slogan, "We can do anything except hear." And that's true. There's deaf lawyers, there's deaf doctors, there's deaf airplane pilots, deaf members of parliament, deaf everything. They are just as intelligent, as capable as we are. They just cannot hear like we do. And so they have to be given the opportunity. Not being able to hear is a disability. But too often, hearing society changes that disability into a handicap. Disability and handicap are not the same thing. The deaf person has a disability. Society makes it a handicap by not giving them the opportunity. Deaf people are just like us. They're just as intelligent as us, just as smart, just as capable, but they're not given the opportunity. They don't have a common language with society, and so they don't get a lot of information. They usually have inferior educations, and sometimes too, they're looked upon as dumb. You've heard that phrase, deaf and dumb. Deaf people really resent that. First of all, because technically they're not dumb. Dumb means you cannot speak. Deaf people can speak, they don't know how. If you don't know Korean, you're not dumb, you just don't know how to speak Korean. Deaf people don't know how to speak the spoken language in their culture. That doesn't mean they're dumb. They can speak, they just don't know how. And they also resent that too, because it means it has the slang meaning of not intelligent. And deaf people are just as intelligent as we are. And so they need to be recognized by society and respected and given the opportunities to get information, to get education, and then the opportunities to use all that in jobs and things. So that's one challenge for hearing society, to understand the needs and the situation of deaf people. Another challenge for hearing society is to include deaf people. They are excluded from information. Most of you will know Helen Keller, who was both deaf and blind, and she accomplished a great deal and was a great model for deaf-blind people. Once when she was interviewed, the interviewer asked her, "You are deaf and blind, but if you had a choice to be either deaf or blind, which would you choose?" And without hesitating a second, she said, "Oh, I would certainly choose to be blind." And most people think, what? Well, I'd much rather be deaf than blind. But Helen Keller said, blindness cuts you off from things. Deafness cuts you off from people. That's isolation. And that's the life experience of deaf people around the world. In some countries, more developed countries, they're doing more to overcome that, providing interpreters, providing more services, making sure that everyone has information. But especially in Cambodia, it's a huge problem, not being included. And so that's what we try to do, to work with, to make deaf people feel included, that they're part of their country, part of their culture, part of their society. And we give them access to that with education, with job training, with interpreters, and try to help them to feel accepted and respected. It's a two-pronged approach. We work with the deaf people to build up their self-image, and we work with the hearing people to help them understand the deaf people and give them an opportunity. It's really, really difficult. So often deaf people feel bad about themselves because they've never been respected, never been affirmed. In places like North America, children in preschool or in kindergarten, they have Christmas plays, they have songs, they do all kinds of things. Their parents come, their brothers and sisters come, grandma and grandpa come, and everybody claps and cheers for them. That doesn't happen for deaf children, especially like here in Cambodia. They never get affirmed, and so they feel that there's something wrong with them. They know they're not respected, they know they're not valued. Very often the parents make it very clear, you are a problem. The other children are working and making money for us, and you can't do that. And so we really need to affirm them. Our need to find the deaf people, to help them get education, to make them have an identity as a deaf community, to give them a feeling of self-worth, to let them feel respected. That's the challenge. And as I mentioned before, just finding them is extremely slow and it's extremely expensive. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about Giving Tuesday. I believe what we're doing is really, really an important ministry. A prayer that I have used a lot over the years, you probably know of Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who was at Gethsemane in Kentucky. But in one of his books, he wrote a prayer, and he said, "My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you." We're doing the best we can here in Cambodia. The government gives no support. The government, I shouldn't say that. The government a year ago took over the schools started by the French NGO, and we're hoping that they will survive because the Ministry of Education doesn't have any experience in working with deaf children. But we have so little resources. We need many, many teams of field workers to go out and find the 58,000 deaf people that we don't know who they are or where they are. And that's where we really need your assistance. We get funding from Caritas Australia, and from the Finnish Foreign Ministry, and from Maryknoll. But all of our donors in this pandemic, our donors have received less money. And so now they are giving us less money. And that has really caused a problem. A year ago, we had to lay off 1/3 of our staff. We just didn't have the money to pay them to continue those job positions. And in the coming year, we're probably going to have to lay off some more. And so we really do need more financial support. And that's why I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. We try to use money very well. We go through audits every year. We do everything according to the proper protocols and working with the Better Business Bureau and everything like that. But what we need, we try to help the deaf people. We need others to help us, DDP, to do what we can. And so we hope that on Giving Tuesday, you would consider supporting the Deaf Development Program here in Cambodia. we would really be able to use the money well, and we promise that we will do that. We try to be very careful. So if you can help us, we say thank you very much. And to show you that in sign language, Cambodian sign language, we say Agun Na. Agun, thank you very much.